In the early days of the American colonies, when vast forests still stretched unbroken from the Atlantic to the distant mountains, the idea of a city was little more than a dream whispered by weary settlers. They came ashore from creaking wooden ships, their faces pale with hope and fear, staring at a land that was wild, untamed, and heavy with promise. The first settlements were nothing more than clusters of rough cabins and muddy streets, where the scent of salt air mixed with smoke from crude chimneys. Every nail, every stone, every board was hauled by hand, for there were no factories yet, only determination and the will to build something that would last. Boston, Jamestown, Philadelphia, names that would later carry the weight of history, began as fragile outposts clinging to survival on the edge of an unknown world. The streets were narrow and crooked, laid out not by planners, but by the paths of wagons and footsteps that simply followed the lay of the land. Livestock wandered freely between homes, children played in the dirt, and the smell of tar, wood, and sweat filled the air where men worked from dawn to dusk. Churches and meeting houses stood at the center of every settlement, not only as places of faith, but as the beating heart of community life. Around them, small markets formed where traders sold furs, grain, and imported goods, precious reminders of the old world across the sea. At night, when the fires burned low, the sound of hammers and saws gave way to the murmur of prayers and the restless sigh of wind through wooden shutters. There were no grand buildings or cobblestone promenades yet, only the rough beginnings of what would one day become the great cities of a new nation. Lanterns glowed faintly in windows of glass, so rare that neighbors came to admire them, and the soft yellow light spilled onto streets still muddy from the rain. Danger was constant fire, sickness, hunger, but so too was the sense of purpose, a shared belief that these crude towns were more than shelter. They were the seeds of a future. In the mornings, the ringing of a blacksmith's hammer mixed with the cry of roosters and the call of merchants opening their doors to another uncertain day. Women tended gardens and cooked over open flames, while men met in taverns to argue about taxes, trade, and rumors from the far colonies. News traveled slowly, often carried by riders through miles of forest and swamp. But each arrival brought the outside world a little closer to their doorsteps. On Sundays, the towns fell silent, save for the tolling of bells and the soft shuffle of boots along dirt paths leading to wooden chapels. In the stillness of those early years, America's first cities were less about buildings and more about belonging communities built from hardship, faith, and the stubborn hope of ordinary people. They did not yet know it, but from these muddy streets and timbered walls would rise the foundations of a new civilization, one defined not by kings or crowns, but by work and will. And as the colonies grew, so too did their towns, spreading like roots through the wilderness, binding the vast land together, one street, one home, one heart at a time. As the 18th century unfolded, the small towns that once huddled along the coast began to stretch inland, their streets lengthening like the roots of an ever-hungry tree. The age of trade had dawned, and with it came ships with deep bellies full of cotton, rum, and sugar, docking at ports that bustled from dawn until the last lantern was snuffed out. Warehouses rose where meadows once stood, and the sound of hammering masts and rolling barrels filled the air like the pulse of a new world finding its rhythm. The scent of the sea mixed with the smoke of blacksmiths' forges, and the sharp tang of tanned leather, a symphony of labor that marked the birth of modern America. Roads improved, bridges were built, and where rivers once cut off progress, ferries and early steamboats began to carry goods and people deeper into the land. Cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore grew not by accident, but by the relentless drive of those who saw opportunity in every stone and every street. The first newspapers appeared, printed on rough paper that left ink on the fingers, but news in the hearts of men hungry for connection beyond their own walls. By the early 1800s, the rumble of industry began to echo, where once only the ring of church bells was heard, and the skyline filled with chimneys breathing smoke into the morning air. Iron replaced wood, and steam replaced muscle, as factories began to hum with machines that turned raw effort into progress. The railroads soon followed iron paths stretching across the land, binding the distant cities together in a network of steel and smoke. Towns that once took weeks to reach could now be visited in a day, and the frontier that had once seemed endless began to shrink beneath the wheels of progress. With the trains came workers, immigrants from every shore, each carrying dreams, languages, and hands eager to build what they hoped would last longer than themselves. Streets that were once muddy paths became lined with brick and cobblestone, and gas lamps flickered proudly along the sidewalks, lighting the way for a restless generation. Above the noise of industry, the laughter of children, and the cries of street vendors painted a new kind of music, one made not by nature, but by human ambition. Cities became places of both wonder and hardship, where fortunes were made and lost within the same crowded blocks. The skyline began to climb higher, stories stacked upon stories, as if men were trying to touch the very sky that had once seemed so far from their reach. With every new building came the echo of old dreams of settlers and farmers who had once prayed for a single roof strong enough to keep out the rain. The streets grew louder, the nights brighter, and the pace of life faster. Yet beneath it all still beat the same heart that had once pulsed in those first wooden towns by the sea. The cities of America had become living things, breathing, growing, changing, each one a reflection of the people who had built them, brick by brick, dream by dream. And though progress came with smoke, noise, and struggle, it also carried the promise of something greater, a nation forging its identity in the glow of its own creation. By the time the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the cities that had once been fragile dreams of wood and clay had grown into giants of glass, iron, and ambition. The rivers that had carried canoes and flatboats now bore steamships and barges heavy with steel, coal, and the hopes of millions chasing a better life. The old dirt roads where wagons once creaked were now paved avenues lined with streetcars, electric lights, and the hum of modernity. Yet, beneath the noise of progress, there still lingered the echoes of the past, the soft strike of a hammer, the creak of a wooden door, the whisper of the first settler's prayers. In every old building's foundation lay the memory of calloused hands that built without blueprint, guided only by need and faith. Grand cathedrals rose where once stood small chapels, and where rough taverns had been, elegant theaters now welcomed laughter, music, and applause. The descendants of farmers and blacksmiths had become merchants, engineers, and dreamers, each generation lifting the next a little higher than before. But progress, for all its beauty, came with a price. The quiet fields vanished. The stars grew dim behind smoke, and time moved faster than hearts could follow. Still, there was pride in what had been achieved, a pride woven into every street name, every bridge, every faded brick that refused to crumble. Old men would sit on park benches, watching the streetcars rattle past, remembering the days when the same ground was nothing but forest and mud. Children ran where once the deer had roamed, their laughter a reminder that even the wildest lands could one day be called home. The American city, in all its noise and wonder, became more than a place. It became a testament to endurance, to vision, to the unyielding spirit of those who refused to give up. For every tower that touched the clouds, there was a story buried deep in the soil beneath it. A story of someone who dreamed before the world knew how to listen. The immigrants, the pioneers, the builders they left behind no crowns or titles, only streets and skylines that spoke of their courage. And though time has turned their wooden houses to dust, their legacy still stands, strong and silent, in the heart of every city that bears their mark. On quiet evenings, when the wind drifts through narrow alleys and rustles old maps in forgotten libraries, you can almost hear them again, the first voices of a new nation being born. They whisper of struggle and hope, of winters survived and summers celebrated, of the simple, stubborn belief that from nothing, something great could rise. And as the sun sets behind the towers and bridges, the glow upon the skyline feels almost sacred, a reminder of how far humanity has come from those muddy, flickering streets. The first American towns were never meant to last forever, but their spirit still walks the streets, wearing new names and new faces, forever building, forever dreaming. For in the end, a city is not made of brick or steel, but of memory and America's first cities. Though long changed, still remember where they came from.